All right, so today we're going to be starting topic number 3, looking at energy systems. This is quite a heavy topic, but we'll be starting off today with 3.1, looking at nutrition. And the nutrition section of this topic, it'll be quite short and basic. So a lot of the terms that we'll talk about, you've probably heard before. We'll look at macronutrients versus micronutrients, glucose and how that works within the body. And then we'll get a little bit deeper when we get to 3.2 and 3.3. So a nice easy start for the beginning of topic number 3 today. So in terms of nutrients, we've got our macronutrients first of all. Remember that prefix macro means large, right? Macronutrients are the large nutrients that make up a large percentage of our diet. We've got carbohydrates, which is our bread, pasta, rice. We have fats, which are also called lipids as well. So you might see fats or lipids written in an exam. Just remember it's the same thing. Things like salmon, avocado, olive oil, nuts, also the fat on the meat that you eat as well. And then we've got protein, which would be the actual meat where the fat isn't around it. Chicken, eggs, dairy products have a lot of protein as well. And then finally, water. People tend to forget water as one of the main macronutrients. But these are our 4 macronutrients. You might have heard people talk about their macros before on Instagram. If you've seen someone talking about their diet, they're talking about their macro split, which sort of means how much of each of these macronutrients they're getting in their diet. Are they eating high protein, high carbohydrate, or low carbohydrate? This is what they're referring to when they're talking about macros. So, in terms of their function, carbohydrates provide quick energy for your cells and your brain. They're broken down into glucose, which helps fuel physical activity. When we're exercising, we need glucose to form quick ATP, and it supports many different body functions, but the brain really loves to use carbohydrates as its main fuel source. Fats are also a fuel source as well. They provide and store energy, but fats are more long-term energy storage. So when you eat a lot of fat, it can get stored in your body, and then that fat can be used as energy. Fats are also important for protecting organs, and they help absorb a lot of vitamins and nutrients as well. We've got good and bad fats, and we're going to talk about that shortly. Then we've got protein. So proteins build and repair tissues like our muscles and our organs. They create different enzymes and hormones and support immune function. And they're made up of amino acids, which are like sort of the building blocks for many of the body functions. I think that our bodies are made up of 15 to 20% protein. So they're not just important for muscle building, but as we've seen when we did the respiratory system, the hemoglobin in our red blood cells is a protein as well. So proteins are very, very important. And then finally, we've got water. Water helps to keep us hydrated. It aids in digestion and nutrient absorption, and it regulates our body temperature, normally through sweating. And we've learnt about that when we did the cardiovascular system and looked at cardiovascular drift, and we saw how important water was in that topic. I think approximately 60% of the human body is made up of water, so it's a very important macronutrient. Okay, and then we have our micronutrients. So micro meaning small. They make up a small percentage of the diet, and our micronutrients are vitamins and minerals. So a few different types of vitamins and minerals on the screen here. You don't have to remember these or remember exactly what they do. I just want you to know that our micronutrients are our vitamins and minerals. They're found in almost all of the foods we eat, especially vegetables, but even like a chicken nugget from McDonald's will have some form of vitamin and mineral in it. It'll just be at a very, very, very low quantity. So they're found in all foods. Some foods have more, some foods have less. If you've heard of a superfood before, superfood generally means that it's loaded with vitamins and minerals. So like your kale and your green leafy vegetables have lots and lots of vitamins and minerals. Vitamins generally tend to help us regulate our metabolism. They support immune function and bone health. Minerals like iron, calcium, zinc, and magnesium are also very important for bone health and nerve function and muscle contraction. So micronutrients are required in small amounts. We don't need to have plenty of iron in our diet, but we need a small amount, and they're vital for maintaining good health and preventing any deficiencies. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at carbohydrates. So we're going to take a look at each of the 4 main macronutrients, being carbohydrates, fats, protein, and water. We won't really look at water so much, so maybe just the 3, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Talk a bit about what they're made up of and what they do in the body. So when we think about carbohydrates, they can actually be split off into 2 different groups. We've got our sugars and we've got fiber. So sugars is what you're thinking of when you think of just, a piece of bread or pasta or rice as a carbohydrate. And we've got 3 different types of sugars. We've got a monosaccharide, which is a single sugar unit. So this is a simple carbohydrate. If you've ever heard anyone say, oh, that's a simple carb, that's a complex carb, this is what I'm talking about here. So it's the most simple form of sugar that we can have. It's just one singular sugar unit. And this comes in the form of glucose, fructose, and galactose. We've got disaccharides, which are 2 sugar units joined together. And these are also a form of simple carbohydrate. It's things like sucrose, lactose, and maltose. You don't have to know specifically what these are, but I want you to know the difference between monosaccharide, disaccharide, and then finally polysaccharide, which is anything over 2 sugar units. This is considered more of a complex carbohydrate, and this includes glycogen and starches, being grains, potatoes, and legumes, and beans, and lentils, and things like that. So just look at those prefixes there: mono, di, and poly. Mono being 1, di 2, and poly anything over 2. That's all you need to remember. We've also got fiber. Fiber is a type of carbohydrate, but it's a little bit different. It's a complex carbohydrate, but it's not fully digestible by the human body. So that's what makes it a little bit different, is we don't actually digest all the fiber that comes into our body. We actually excrete it out when we go to the toilet. So fiber is super, super important because it aids in digestion, and it's got a lot of other health benefits as well. So there's 2 different types of fiber. We've got soluble fiber, which dissolves in water and helps to lower our blood cholesterol and glucose levels. It's found in oats, apples, beans. And then we've got insoluble fiber, which does not dissolve in water and helps add bulk to our stool, to our toilet products, and promotes regular bowel movements, and that's found in grains, nuts, and vegetables. So 2 different types of fiber playing 2 different roles in health and nutrition. But fiber is really good in the diet. I believe the recommendation is about 25 grams of fiber a day. And if you've ever tracked your food that you're eating or your calories, if you've used an app like MyFitnessPal, for example, and you log your food in there, it actually counts how much fiber you've had as well. And you can see that if you play around on the app, what your fiber intake for the day was, and we should be aiming for around 25 grams per day. So I've got glucose and glycogen highlighted in yellow there because this is what we're going to be talking about for a while. These are the 2 most important forms of carbohydrate. And to put it in the simplest form, when we eat a simple sugar unit, when we eat carbohydrates that are made of glucose, they actually get stuck together almost. They sort of come together and they connect to create glycogen. So they're related in a way. Glucose is the singular unit, and when you have many different glucose units connected, that forms glycogen. And we're going to look at that more right now. So like I said, Glucose, it's the most important carbohydrate in the body. When we're talking about blood sugar, we're talking about glucose. So if you know anyone with diabetes who has to check their blood sugar levels, what they're actually checking is their blood glucose levels. It's the primary source of energy for the brain and also for intense exercise. So your brain and your spinal cord love using glucose for energy. And also when you're doing intense, short exercise, you're using glucose to create that ATP, that energy, which we'll talk about later in this unit. Like I said before, it's stored in the body as glycogen. So glucose units connect together and get stored in the body as glycogen. And glycogen stores are in our skeletal muscles and in our liver. That's where glycogen lives in the body. So when we've eaten a lot of carbohydrates, there's a lot of glucose in our blood, which we don't need to use right now. So just say I've just had a really high carbohydrate dinner and then I'm lying in bed. My body's not going to use that glucose right away for energy because I'm just lying down. I don't need it. So that glucose that's floating around is going to become stored as glycogen in my liver or in my skeletal muscles. And the term glycolysis is the breakdown of glucose to create energy. So let's say I eat a really high carb dinner. That's stored as glycogen in my liver and in my muscles. That process can then be reversed where, say I need the glucose now, I'm doing some exercise, I'm going to need that glucose. The body can break that glycogen back down into the form of glucose, and then that glucose can go through the process of glycolysis to create energy. And glucose is the primary source of energy for intense exercise. So 15 seconds to 2 minute time period is when I'm really using that glucose for my energy. It's before I start using the oxygen pathways. So glucose is that stored energy in my body, or glycogen is the stored version of that energy in the body. So carbohydrate. If we're thinking about the molecular level now, which we're going to look at, let's break down this term. Carbohydrate. Carbohydrate. Carbon, water. So a carbohydrate is carbon and water, or carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. So here I have the breakdown of that. 1 carbon, 2 hydrogen, and 1 oxygen. This is what forms a carbohydrate. And this is the ratio that a glucose molecule appears in. Now, it would be too simple if a glucose molecule looked just like this. A glucose molecule is actually going to look something more like this. So I said before, 1 carbon, 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen is the ratio. Now times that by 6. A glucose molecule is 6 carbon, 12 hydrogen, and 6 oxygen. All right. And again, it would be too easy if the glucose molecule looked like these little circles here. What it actually looks like is this. So this is the most simple form of a glucose molecule that we'll see. And when you first look at that diagram, it might look a little bit complex, but if I count up the C's in this picture, I'm going to count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. If I count all the H's, I'm going to get to 12 hydrogen. And if I count up all the O's, I'm going to get to 6 again, 6 oxygen. So a singular molecule of glucose is 6 carbon, 12 hydrogen, 6 oxygen. Okay, and it can come in different shapes and forms. It is not necessarily always going to look like this one on the screen, but if you count up those C's and H's and O's, there's always going to be 6 carbon, 12 hydrogen, and 6 oxygen. Now, like I said before, glucose in the body, it can combine to form disaccharides or polysaccharides. We saw before that a disaccharide is 2 and a polysaccharide is over 2. And this occurs through something called the condensation reaction. And we can have glucose molecules up to 60,000 glucose molecules long. So it's not just going to be 2 or 3, they can be up to 60,000 when they get stored in the body as glycogen. So we're going to talk about how these 2 glucose molecules might combine to form a disaccharide or a polysaccharide now. So first thing I want to point out is these OH little parts of the glucose molecule here. So what happens is we're going to get something called a glycosidic bond, which is where these glucose molecules combine through a reaction called the condensation reaction. Okay, and a water molecule is going to be released. So we need water to be released for this to happen. So OH and HO are going to combine here, and I'm left with H2O2, right? So I've got two H's and two hydrogens and two oxygens. Now I said before that a water molecule is going to be released. So from this, I'm going to take H2O. There's water, 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen, right? So I'm going to take H2O, and I'm just left with 1 oxygen molecule in the circle above. Now that oxygen is going to take its place back at the top left, and it's going to combine to a carbon on the other glucose molecule, and that is our glycosidic bond. That is our condensation reaction. So the oxygen and the carbon will combine. We've lost a molecule of water there, and this is a disaccharide. For it to become a polysaccharide, that process just repeats over and over and over. So we can have chains of up to 60,000 glucose molecules, like I said. So here we're only seeing 4. This would be a tiny, tiny little one. So remember, polysaccharides are many glucose molecules linked together through these glycosidic bonds that occur through this condensation reaction where we're losing a molecule of water. This process can be reversed, like I said before. When we have glycogen that's stored in our muscles, we can use that glycogen, reverse this process, and get our glucose back to go into the cell and to create energy. Okay, we're going to have a look at fats now. So fats, like I said again, also called lipids, but all fats are made up of molecules called triglycerides. So triglycerides is just, think of it as another word for fats. If you've got high triglycerides in your blood, it means you've got high fat in your blood. Now we've got 2 different types of fat. We've got saturated fat and unsaturated fat. So saturated fat is the bad fat. We want to limit this kind of fat. And unsaturated fat is good fats. So we want to have or increase this kind of good fat that we can eat. Now in the IB, they like to split this up, and they say saturated fats are animal fats and unsaturated fats are plant fats. So if you want, you can think of it like that. It might make it easy to remember that saturated is animal, unsaturated is plants, but it doesn't always work that way. There are some saturated fats in plants. So let's talk about some examples. So butter, cheese, meat, full fat dairy, and coconut oil are big contributors to saturated fat. Also, surprisingly, is eggs and prawns or shrimp have a high amount of saturated fat in them. Now I've put eggs and prawns in grey there because they're a little bit debated. Whilst they do have saturated fat in them, they've also got a lot of other nutrients and vitamins and minerals that might offset that negative effect of the saturated fat. In terms of unsaturated or our good fats, we've got our plant oils like olive oil, canola oil, nuts and seeds, avocado, olives, and then also salmon. So salmon is a form of good fat. And you'll notice when you look at these, like an easy way to remember saturated from unsaturated fats is that saturated fats tend to be solid at room temperature and then liquid above room temperature. So think about your butter. When your butter's in the fridge, it's solid. When you put it on the pan, it melts. Think about coconut oil. When it's a cold day outside, that coconut oil is white in the jar and hard, versus if it's really hot outside, that coconut oil will melt and become like a liquid. That doesn't happen with our unsaturated fats. So why are they good and why are they bad? Now, our saturated fats can increase the cholesterol that circulates within our blood and increase the risk of heart disease. So when we have high cholesterol in that blood, what that can do is form plaques in the blood vessels. And you can see a picture of that here. So we've got a blood vessel. In the top, it's all clear. Those red blood cells are flowing through without any obstruction. In the middle, we're starting to build that yellowy obstruction there. That's a plaque in the blood vessel, which can be caused by high cholesterol. And then in the last picture is something we really don't want to happen, is if that plaque gets too big, it can block that blood vessel completely and no more red blood cells can get through. And this right here is a clot. So if you have ever known anyone with like a DVT, which is a clot in the lower leg, it sometimes occurs with people flying on aeroplanes for too long. A stroke can be formed by a clot. So if we have a clot blocking blood in the brain, that can cause a stroke. If we have a clot that blocks the blood flow in the heart, that can cause a heart attack. So it's not good to have high cholesterol. Now, our unsaturated fat actually does the complete opposite. It can reduce cholesterol and improve heart health. So we really want to be making sure that in terms of our overall diet and fats, that we're getting most of our fats from the unsaturated fat and not too much from the bad saturated fat. Now, in terms of a molecule of triglyceride, it's quite simple. It looks a bit complicated on here, but there's only two things that you need to know. A triglyceride has a glycerol backbone, seen in the blue there, and 3 fatty acid tails. So that's all you're looking for when you're looking at different molecules. For the triglyceride, you're looking for the glycerol backbone, that little tail at the end, and then the 3 fatty acid chains coming off of that. And that tells me this here must be a triglyceride. It looks very different to the glucose molecule that we saw before. Now, if I was to just have a look at one of those individual chains, I can tell if it's a saturated or an unsaturated fat by looking at those 3 fatty acid chains. So a saturated fat, firstly, think about that term. Saturated means it's full of something. This saturated fat is full of those hydrogen ions. So you can see there's H all the way across the top and H all the way across the bottom. In an unsaturated fat, when we look at those fatty acid chains on the back, we have something called a double bond. So you can see that where I've circled the double bond, rather than connecting to a hydrogen ion, the carbons are kind of connecting to each other. You can see that there's 2 lines there connecting them. And that's what a double bond is. And that's what tells me that that must be an unsaturated fat. 1 double bond, 2 double bonds, 3 double bonds. It doesn't really matter how many it has, but just know that for an unsaturated fat, it's going to have 1 or more of these double bonds where the carbon is connected to another carbon rather than having hydrogen everywhere on both sides. Okay, proteins. So proteins in the body are amino acids, and we've got 20 different types of amino acids. You don't need to know all 20, you just need to know that there's 20 different types of amino acids. All proteins or all 20 of these amino acids look slightly different, but they all have one thing in common, and that is that they all contain a carbon, a hydrogen, an oxygen, and a nitrogen. Some might contain other molecules, some might contain more carbons or more oxygens, but all of them have these 4 in common. So if there's a carbon, a hydrogen, an oxygen, and a nitrogen, you know that it must be one of the 20 amino acids. Now, you may have heard of before essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids. We need to know the distinction between these terms. So an essential amino acid means it must be obtained through diet. Think it's essential that we eat that, right? And a non-essential amino acid means it can be synthesized by the body. The body can make it. We don't have to eat it to get these non-essential amino acids, but we do need all 20. We have to eat 9 of them, and the body can make 11 of them. So there's 9 essential amino acids and 11 non-essential amino acids. And if we were to look at the molecular structure of these amino acids, this is what they look like. See what I mean about how they all kind of slightly look different? Well, if you were to go and look at each of these individual molecules, you'd be able to count on every single one at least 1 oxygen, 1 carbon, 1 hydrogen, and 1 nitrogen. They all have some formation of those 4 ions. Okay, we're going to talk about energy now. So it helps to think, if you've ever tracked your food for a day, like I said earlier, MyFitnessPal is one of the apps where you can do that. If you've tracked your food for a day and tried to work out how many calories you're eating, how much carbohydrate, how much protein, how much fat, this will be very interesting to you. And if not, we can have a go at doing it one day and seeing how much you're eating and how much of each macronutrient you're eating. Something that's really interesting is that each macronutrient has a different energy density. So 1 gram of carbohydrate is 4 calories. 1 gram of protein is 4 calories. 1 gram of fat is 9 calories, and water is 0. Interestingly, I've also put alcohol on there, which is 7 calories per gram. So the one I want to point out is the fat. Notice how many more calories fat is per gram. So if you were to eat a really high fat diet, you'd be eating a lot more calories than someone who's eating a low fat diet, because fats are so much more calorie dense. They have a lot of calories in them, at 9 calories per gram compared to 4. Now, if we were to look at what someone ate in a day, and we looked back on the entire day and counted up all the carbohydrates, all the protein, and all the fat, and this is what we got. So let's pretend this person ate 230 grams of carbohydrates, 120 grams of protein, and 60 grams of fat. We could work out how many calories they're eating. So 230 times 4 means they're getting 920 calories from carbohydrates. 120 times 4 means that this person got 480 calories from protein and then 540 calories from fat. And the total calorie intake for this theoretical person is 1,940 calories. Now, the amount of calories that you need to eat each day to maintain energy is really dependent on the person and what that person's trying to do. Are you just trying to maintain your weight and live a relatively normal, sedentary sort of lifestyle? Are you an athlete who's doing a lot of exercise? Are you a child? Are you male or female? That's all going to affect the amount of calories we're going to eat in a day. Also, if we're looking to lose weight, we're going to want to eat less calories in a day. So there's a few different factors that we need to consider when it comes to addressing how much energy or how many calories we need. Those things are age. So as a child, you're not going to need to eat so much compared to as a growing adolescent or as an adult. And then in adulthood, as we get older, into older age, we actually need to eat less and less. So the amount of food that we eat should decline. And that's actually why you see a lot of weight gain in much older people, is because they've been eating a certain amount their whole life. It's very hard to then eat less, but your body doesn't need as much. So if you still eat the same amount of food, that's going to get stored as excess energy and eventually into fat. Our gender or our sex, males generally need more calories than females. Our body size, so the bigger you are, the more calories you'll need to maintain your energy. The smaller you are, the less you'll need. Your activity level, so are you working on your feet all day, running around, or do you have an office job? That's going to affect how much energy you need from food. And then the intensity of physical activity. Are you doing lots of long, high intensity physical activity? That's going to push up how much energy you need. Are you not doing anything at all? Are you sedentary, just watch TV all day? That's going to decrease the amount of calories you need. So if we look at this in terms of a weight loss perspective, you've got your food intake on one side of the scale, right? Your energy intake. How many calories are you eating? How much protein, carbohydrates, fats are you eating? And then we've got energy expenditure. So physical activity is going to affect our energy expenditure. If we're doing a lot of activity, we're going to be expending a lot more energy. We're going to need more food to maintain our current activity levels. Our RMR, that stands for our resting metabolic rate. So if you've got a high resting metabolic rate, this would be someone who, someone might say, I've got a really high metabolism. What they're referring to is the resting metabolic rate, the rate at which that glucose is turning over into energy within their body. If you've got a high resting metabolic rate, you may need more food than someone with a lower resting metabolic rate. And then TEF is the thermic effect of feeding. And this one's quite interesting because different macronutrients have got different thermic effects of feeding. So, for example, protein is the most satiating nutrient. It takes the longest for digestion. So if you're eating a very high protein diet, you're likely to feel fuller for longer as well. So all of these things can affect that energy balance. Now, if we look at just the general recommendations for a healthy diet, we've got our macronutrients. So carbohydrates, let's talk about that one first. So this is just for a general person, not an elite athlete, just an average person. It's said that carbohydrates should make up 45 to 65% of your total energy intake. So it's quite high. So remember, carbohydrates isn't just your bread and pasta. There's a lot of carbohydrates in vegetables as well, and potatoes and things like that. Protein should be about 10 to 35% of your total energy intake. Fats around 20 to 35% of the total energy intake. And then water between 2 and 3 liters. And that's dependent also on your activity level. We've also got some numbers for grams per kilogram. So for carbohydrates, rather than represented as a percentage of your total energy intake, sometimes you're given recommendations based off your body weight. So about 3 to 7 grams per kilogram of body weight. For protein, about 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. So if I weighed 60 kilos, I would be wanting to eat about at least like 50 grams of protein per day. Now, if we look at an athletic population, first thing is athletes are going to need higher calories. They're going to need to eat more, have a higher caloric intake to support energy expenditure. Because they're doing so much exercise, they're going to be burning these calories and they need to replenish that. They're going to be burning glucose and glycogen. They need to replenish their glycogen stores. They need to increase their protein for muscle repair and growth. So rather than 0.8 grams per kilogram, we've now got a recommendation of between 1.2 and 1.4 grams per kilogram for endurance sports athletes. And then it becomes even higher for resistance and speed sports, where we're using or where we're damaging the muscle more. We need more protein to help build and repair that muscle. Focus on carbohydrates for sustained energy. So athletes often have a much higher carbohydrate diet, about 7 to 12 grams per kilogram. And their fat intake should not be below 15% of total energy. So they still need to make sure that they're getting some fats. Fats are really important for a lot of the metabolic processes in the body, and a lot of the vitamins and the minerals that we need fats to help them absorb. So we should never have a fat intake of below 15% of total energy. And this is a good time to talk about one of the very popular diets at the moment, which is the ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diet is quite interesting because it really changes up the percentage breakdown of the macronutrients. So here we're seeing a very, very, very low carb diet. They recommend carbs be about 5% of the total energy intake. Protein, 20%, so still quite normal for the protein. And then fats make up a large majority of the diet at 75%. And there is a few problems with this low carb diet, especially when we think about athletes, but just in general, there's a few interesting things to talk about when it comes to the ketogenic diet. So with this kind of a diet, we're really restricting carbs and increasing fat. Now, when glycogen is stored in the body, it's stored with water. So when the glycogen is stored in the liver and in the muscles, there's actually water molecules attached to that glycogen. So if we deplete our carbohydrate and we're not eating any more carbohydrate, we're going to use up all those glycogen stores. With that, we'll be getting rid of that water that's stored with them. So often people who do this very low carb diet see that they lose weight very quickly. But that weight that they've lost is not weight from fat, it's weight from the water that was stored with the glycogen. And it's very difficult to maintain a diet like this over a long period. So what happens is when carbs are reintroduced into the diet, that water comes straight back and is stored with the glycogen. So it's not the most efficient way of losing fat. You're not losing fat at all, you're losing water, especially in that early stage. Once you get past that, you can obviously lose fat on this diet. But there's a few other things to talk about with the ketogenic diet as well. Second one being the other important function of carbohydrates is that it supports the brain with energy. So the brain really only likes to consume carbohydrates for energy. It's its preferred fuel source. So when you deplete carbohydrates, you might notice that for the first couple of days, you become really irritable and angry, and you've got this brain fog until your body sort of adjusts to its new situation, and it can learn to use fat or ketones for energy. So that's where the term ketogenic diet comes in, is because your body ends up using the ketones for energy. And ketones, you don't need to know what they are. They're just a product of the fat being used for energy. There's also some health reasons as to why you might not want to consider this diet. Firstly, it's normally very low in fiber because you're not getting a lot of those green leafy vegetables, which can cause digestive issues. And it also tends to be quite high in animal fat. So, high amount of meat, high amount of butter, which can really increase that cholesterol and lead to cardiovascular problems that we've spoken about before and we saw with those plaques. And then lastly, if you're an athlete, this is really not the diet that you want to follow because it has a big impact on exercise performance because we don't have that glucose, we're not storing that glycogen, we don't have that readily available energy anymore. And you can see that in this graph. So here in this study, they looked at some different diets, low carb, high carb, and a normal carb diet, and the time to exhaustion. So time to exhaustion, let's just imagine they got on a bike or a treadmill and exercised until they were exhausted and couldn't do any more. So with a low carb diet, they only lasted 50 minutes. On a normal carb diet, it was 100 minutes, and on a high carb diet, it was 200 minutes. So that's why you'll often see athletes have very high carb, high protein, low fat diets for the most part. Time to exhaustion is very much an aerobic exercise outcome. So we're talking more about endurance or our cardiovascular sort of exercise here, but also low carb diets aren't very good for anaerobic exercise either. So keep that in mind, that it doesn't just have a negative effect on aerobic exercise, it has a negative effect on anaerobic exercise as well. So a low carb diet really negatively impacts exercise performance. Okay, so just as a quick review, some of the molecules here. So glucose, remember it's 6 carbon, 12 hydrogen, 6 oxygen. You just have to count up the letters that you see on that molecule. And if you get 6 carbon, 12 hydrogen, 6 oxygen, you know it's a glucose. For fat or triglycerides, it's got that glycerol backbone and 3 fatty acid chains. We can tell the difference between saturated and unsaturated fats because saturated fats are full of hydrogen ions, whereas unsaturated fats are missing some of those hydrogen ions and instead have a double bond. So looking at this triglyceride in this picture here, I could confidently say that this is a saturated fat. Protein. All proteins or amino acids have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. They might have some other compounds as well. For example, in this one you see an R, but you can still see a C, a H, an O, and an N. That tells me straight away that this must be one of our 20 amino acids. All right, that is all for 3.1 nutrition.